Good news, everyone. I am not dead. After a pretty terrible week of the flu and another week of recovery, I can make videos again. I suppose that last part isn't good news to everybody, and if it's not for you, then you are welcome to leave anytime you like. So, now what? Well, I had planned on making a few remote videos round and about the county that I live in, but, so that's not happening. But I still have little to do and much to say, so I will be making a video. It's just that the footage is mostly going to be cobbled together from pictures that I already have and media that I'm able to get a hold of, instead of me making my own video stuff for what's relatively close to my house. It's just not within 2 kilometers. And it's the first part of a new series, Donegal and WW1. In which I discuss the various ways the Great War intersected with this rural and isolated part of Ireland. Title card! So what we're going to be talking about today is this gun. Not just the gun, but also the ship that it came on. Now this is not far from my house, as I said, but more than 2 kilometers away. And just take a look at it. This gun used to be on a ship, the SS Laurentic. The gun is in Downings because the rest of the ship is nearby, at the bottom of the sea. We will get to the story of why the ship is down there and the gun is topside with us vertebrates, but here's the thing. The sinking of the Laurentic is maybe only the 2nd or 3rd most interesting story in its storied career. Scene transition! Ordered as an ocean liner and mail carrier by the Dominion Line for its Liverpool to Canada route. It was constructed in Belfast by Harland and Wolff, who you may recognize from this. Midway through construction, the ship and its sister, the Megantic, were bought by the White Star Line, who you may recognize from this. Actually, the Laurentic was something of an experiment for the Titanic. While the Megantic was fitted with a more conventional steam engine, the Laurentic had a novel triple expansion engine, which for some reason is more efficient and faster than the previously existing types of engines. So that was implemented on one of the worst disasters in nautical history, which in turn gave us one of the worst films in cinematic history and one of the worst actors in actoring history. That man has been banking on a 4-year window of handsomeness for decades. Let it never be said that I did that. My window was much smaller, about a 2-week period last summer. It's all downhill from here, buddy. The Laurentic began its maiden voyage from Liverpool to Quebec City on the 29th of April, 1909. Interestingly, its destination, Quebec City and Montreal, are both on the St. Lawrence River, which is the namesake. It was to travel on the St. Lawrence, it was Laurentic. Point is, unlike some White Star ocean liners with novel triple expansion engines, this one actually managed to complete its maiden voyage. But by far the strangest incident to take place surrounding this ship was the capture of Holly Harvey Crippen. Scene transition! Harvey Crippen, whose name sounds like a Scotch snap, was a homeopath and the proud owner of this mustache. From Coldwater, Michigan, where the water is cold. Now back then, homeopathy was less alternative medicine and more medicine. I mean, this is what passed for conventional medicine, so the idea that you could put a drop of what ailed you in a bottle of alcohol and shake it and dilute it 20 times didn't seem insane. But that was in America, the land of deregulation. In Britain, you couldn't call yourself a doctor of homeopathy. It just wasn't a thing. Now, you can argue about whether or not that's a good thing, but that's just how it was, and is. So when Crippen moved to London with his wife Cora, they found themselves quite a bit more poor than they'd anticipated. Cora fancied herself a singer, but nobody much fancied her singing. So while Crippen was trying to help manage his wife's stage career, he also had to work as a distributor for patent medicines, which was somewhat related to his previous training. And through her job, Cora managed to make friends with various entertainers and socialites, including the strongwoman Volcana, who may soon become your favorite character in this entire affair. Speaking of affairs, the Crippens had a lot of them. They didn't really seem to like each other, care for each other, treat each other particularly well. Their resentment was certainly building as time went on, and they flaunted their disregard for one another. Now, in January or February of 1910, Hawley started telling people that his wife had gone to America to visit relatives. But soon he was informing people that she had sadly passed away while there. Very sadly. He was very sad about it, indeed. Incidentally, his mistress had moved in with him at this time, and she started wearing the late Mrs. Crippen's clothes and jewelry. No doubt in honor of the late Cora Crippen. Now, to Volcana, the strong woman, something didn't quite add up. Her friend hadn't informed her of any trip stateside, and, well, there's no doubt that Hawley was quite happy to see her gone. Permanently. So, Scotland Yard started looking into it as more and more performers and sundry troublemakers started raising their concerns. Some detectives came poking around the Crippen house and asked a few questions. After the interview, Crippen and his girl Friday got antsy and fled to Canada. On, you guessed it, the Montrose. I promise the Laurentic will factor into this at some point. Unbeknownst to Crippen and Co., though, the police were quite convinced by their lies, and it wasn't until they fled the country that they realized that something was probably up. They dug round the house and found what appeared to be the late Mrs. Crippen's abdomen, though the rest of her remains remained at large. Meanwhile, the captain of the Montrose realized that he probably had some fugitives on board, their disguises being quite unconvincing, saying, "Mustache taken off, isn't that a shame, growing beard. Accomplice dressed as boy, manner and build undoubtedly a girl." Now Scotland Yard was on its back foot. Crippen and his friend had a head start. If he managed to get to Canada, he could well escape into the vast frontiers of the Great White North, or make his way to America, where, being an American citizen, they would have to go through extradition proceedings and risk losing their quarry. What were they to do? Inspector...
Chief Inspector!
Chief Inspector Dew of Scotland Yard hopped aboard the Laurentic and raced to greet his man in Quebec. The Laurentic arrived in good time, time enough for the inspector...
Chief Inspector!
Chief Inspector to get disguised as a pilot and get on the Montrose as it was ferried into the harbor. Crippen was invited to come and meet the pilots when one of them said, "Good morning, Dr. Crippen. Do you know me? I'm Chief Inspector Dew of Scotland Yard." Crippen was returned to England on the Laurentic's sister ship and hanged after a 4-day trial. So, there we go. The fastest ship at the Atlantic helped catch a murderer. Or did it? I know I'm straying pretty far off the topic of this episode, but there is some evidence that Crippen was innocent, or maybe killed his wife by accident. In any event, everybody involved is long dead now, and even the ship that the inspector...
Chief Inspector!
If I had my shoe, I'd throw it at you. Imagine that I did. Chief Inspector sailed on at the bottom of the sea, which is really what this episode was going to be about, but that story was so interesting I just had to go into it. But why did the Laurentic find itself at the bottom of the North Sea, just a few miles off the Irish coast? Scene transition. Are you doing? In 1914, somebody shot an unfriendly man, and many more unfriendly men got very upset at each other about it. They were so upset, in fact, that they decided to host the biggest war in human history up to that point. The biggest war in non-human history, of course, being the very real battle in San Diego between competing colonies of the Argentine brown ant, Linepthema humillae. I am not making that up. In response to this unprecedented level of violence, Britain decided to put as many guns on as many things as it could. They tried putting guns on cars, guns on tractors, and guns on guns. Most relevant to our story, they started putting guns on boats that usually didn't have guns. See, since the end of the golden age of piracy, it wasn't really necessary to put cannons and whatnot on merchant ships. They just didn't need them. The waters were relatively safe at the turn of the century, until U-boats and all that other kind of nastiness brought back the old tradition of the merchant cruiser. The Laurentic was one of these merchant cruisers. The Laurentic and its guns had some grand old times, traveling the world together and shooting at things in Sierra Leone, Hong Kong, good old Canada, until finally it found itself in a Navy base in Buncrana. Anyway, on one fateful day in 1917, the captain of the Laurentic decided that he was bored of waiting for an escort, and they left port alone. Things went pretty well for about an hour, and then they struck a mine near the Fanhead Lighthouse. It turns out that the Germans had mined up the whole mouth of Loch Swilly. Because there was no other ships nearby, there wasn't anyone to pull the sailors out of the sea. They all made it to the lifeboats, but those quickly turned into death boats, with the temperature being about minus 13 degrees Celsius, 9 degrees Fahrenheit, also known as incredibly cold. About 3/4 of the crew didn't make it the short trip to shore. Obviously, this was an immense disaster. But in more ways than one, not only was there a tremendous loss of life, but arguably more importantly to the Royal Navy, there was also 35 imperial tons of gold on board. The Navy sent some 5,000 dive missions from 1917, when the war was still on, I'll remind you, and U-boats were going back and forth all through there, until 1922. They managed to get the bulk of it, but not all of it. After that, the salvage rights went to a private company who managed to get all but 25 bullions out, which remain unaccounted for. Supposedly, they're still resting there, either at the bottom of the seabed or under it, and I encourage you to risk life and limb in order to retrieve this precious metal. It's 25 bullions. That's presumably a lot. Anyway, in 2007, 90 years after the wreck, the people around Downings decided to raise some money to buy airbags and other equipment needed to raise one of the Laurentic's guns and tow it to the pier in Downings so that people would have something to look at and take pictures of, like I did. Full circle. Join us next week for part 2, which is about this place.